All right, I think we will start our event now. So it's 7:05. Gabe, if you want to start recording, that'd be great. Okay, so just want to welcome everyone to Fitz Debate's first event. So we wanted to make sure that everyone, no matter your ability or your background in debating and speaking, that we have some introductory events so that people are feeling comfortable and that they are able to go to any debates in the future or feel like they've actually have some kind of background knowledge, because we really want to make sure that this society is quite diverse and welcoming to all people, no matter kind of your background. Especially, I think debating is seen as something that is quite intimidating and quite scary, because a lot of people are discussing quite important ideas and very topical issues. But at the same time, when you break it down, it is quite digestible and it's something that everyone can really pick up. So I think this is why we really wanted to push a lot of kind of introductory events to make sure people are able to learn and feel comfortable doing so. So debating is pretty important. I think it's a way to share ideas and your arguments, and then you're doing so while kind of arguing against another team. And it involves more than just arguing, but working with other people, understanding current affairs, and trying to convince the audience by framing your arguments in a coherent and logical way. So overall, your aim in debating is to convince your audience as to why your side of the motion should be believed or should be like considered the correct one. And so generally, when you're debating, you want to break it down into two things: substantive arguments, which is your actual arguments of why you want to support or oppose a motion, and then rebuttal, which is then criticisms of the other side. So today, we'll be covering overall some of the skills about how to be a good debater, and these are individual skills that you need. So not only are these kind of skills you need as a debater, but also in everyday life as well. So hopefully you'll find this quite an interesting and useful session. So overall, we're going to talk about what it takes to be a good individual speaker, and then later on in the year, during Michaelmas of 2021, we will run another event just to talk about debating as a whole. So make sure you stick around for that. And if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And this is being recorded, which will be uploaded to our YouTube channel very soon. So part one of today, we'll be talking about how to write substantive. Part two, which will be covered by Jake, he will be talking about how to rebut or argue directly in response to the opposition. And thirdly, we'll go over how to present effectively as a speaker. Okay, so part one, how to write a substantive. So good debating speeches are ones that are well analyzed and have a lot of arguments that follow on logically, and the analysis actually explained quite well, where it's easy for the audience to follow along, which means that each step of your analysis needs to be clearly explained rather than jumping on from say the topic and then just a random line that you haven't really explained further. So I think this is quite a good model for how you want to argue well and effectively. So firstly, you want to kind of talk about what the status quo is, or what is the current issue at hand. So you should describe it in a way that is more favorable to your side. So for example, if you want to enact a change because something is, so badly or so going so badly, or something has to be, something so bad that the government has to step in, you really need to frame the status quo as something that is deplorable, it's just requiring change and all of that. And so by setting up the situation of what is happening now, that gives the audience an idea of the kind of world that you're debating in. Secondly, you want to talk about what the actual action is and what you want to be implementing. It could be a government policy, or it could be just a general, like something that your side supports. And then lastly, you want to talk about how that's going to happen and the result of what your change is. So really, this should take up the bulk of your argument. So firstly, you want to talk about how the result is different from the status quo. Potentially, you mention that in this example on the screen, talking about cannabis, for example. And then secondly, you want to talk about how it's meaningful, better than any other alternative. And something that is quite effective is you can say, like, even if this happened, or the reason why this, XYZ is not a better alternative, because that shows that you're actually considering other examples as well, but then ultimately proving why your side is the best case scenario. So secondly, the use of examples. So examples obviously are quite important because they're used to strengthen your point, and it's very useful in giving the audience a more concrete example of what exactly you're talking about. And so it could be use of evidence and statistics, it could be everyday examples or case studies or even observations to kind of clarify what you're trying to say. But the most important thing is that examples shouldn't be just the argument in itself. So you shouldn't have an argument that's like centered around an example, because they should be used to validate your reasoning and embody what you were saying rather than just standing on its own. So let's take a look at an example in illustrating how to use an example. So if you wanted to talk about sanctions, so you can't just say sanctions work. So sanctions are like a threatened penalty to, for example, incentivize to follow a rule or like obey a certain law. So instead of just saying sanctions work, you want to give examples as to how they worked in the past. So you could say, for example, placing sanctions on South Africa was an effective way in ending the apartheid. So obviously don't just stop there, but then go into detail of how specifically a sanction worked, and not say negotiations between governments or any other alternative. By applying it, by having an example, that you should then link it to your overall argument as to why your overall argument does stand regardless of this example. So it's not only true in like the South African case, but also you can see that this is also true in many circumstances, and therefore we believe that sanctions ultimately do work, something like that. So yes, so they need to validate your reasoning, which means that it needs to follow your analysis rather than go before it. Secondly, it needs to be relevant. So often you want to use ones that are modern if possible, but more importantly, you should be able to make the link between the example and the actual case. So you shouldn't have to spend so much time explaining why some obscure example that you found is related to your overall argument. And so like often analogies are very important. So talk about the similarities between the two cases and why in one circumstance it is very important, therefore should be applied to another. Thirdly, don't have too many, otherwise just a bit of a burden on the listener, and they might find it hard to follow. And especially be careful with statistics, because I think a lot of people would like to put a lot of numbers in it, but it can often kind of disengage the audience. And lastly, I think it's very important to use your examples in a way that is prioritized. So you want to choose the best examples. So for example, the more recent ones, I think hypothetical examples aren't the best because they're not really concrete in reality. And so similarly with personal anecdotes, while they can be true, is not necessarily the strongest when you're arguing. So I think the ones which are most effective are case studies or things that have appeared in recent news, because often people have heard of it anyway. And some useful sources could be like The Economist or BBC News and Foreign Affairs. So these are the things that you could be reading up on to get your examples. Okay, so this is very similar to how we used to write essays in high school and all of that, but I think it is a quite useful way to think about how you want to actually incorporate examples into your argument. And this is like not just examples, but also how you want to step through your argumentation. So you want to go through reason, explanation, evidence, and link. So reason, that's just the general kind of tagline or the headline, which is like kind of the most persuasive thing you want to highlight. That's like the general, if you had to summarize your specific argument, that is going to be the reason. Explanation is you want to think why this is important or why this is a good reason. Often you might think like, oh, obviously it's important, but actually step it through and kind of place it in the context and explain why in this scenario it is imperative that this argument is like acknowledged. Thirdly is evidence. So kind of what I was saying before, but examples are very important here, and you should try to use a lot of relevant pieces of evidence to back up your point. And then lastly, I think a lot of speakers sometimes forget to do is link, but it's actually link back to your overall side, whether you're opposing or proposing the motion, but also why that is relevant to your overall argument, to the wider claim you're making. And it's actually very important because instead of making the audience kind of link together the points in their head by themselves. You really want to articulate it to them so that it's much easier to understand. So I think it'd be a good idea to actually go through a specific motion. One, let's say we want to talk about the motion, this house would legalize prostitution. And so we're going to say propose, so we agree. So the reason, short and simple, is legal prostitution is going to be safer than illegal prostitution. So that's the general kind of side that we are arguing. So then now this is the explanation. So remember to start talking about the context or what is happening now. So you can say, at this moment in time, prostitution is illegal and is deregulated. As a consequence of this illegality, it occurs naturally without any controlling measures from the state. So then now you want to talk about the action, which is what your side is proposing. If something is legal, it can be regulated. Removing criminality from prostitution could result in state-regulated brothels in which there is compulsory contraception, legal protection, and other such as safeguards. And then lastly, you want to talk about what will then occur as a result of your proposition. So you can say something like, if there is a legal prostitution sector, there will be no more incentive for prostitutes to operate on a very dangerous black market where their safety and their health is at jeopardy. So as a result, the black market will slowly kind of dissipate and it will become a much better result for everyone. Okay, so next you want to talk about evidence. So for example, you could say an Australian study shows that STIs were 80 times higher in the illegal sector of prostitution than in comparable legal sectors. So obviously that's backing up your argument rather than standing alone. And then lastly, you want to make a link. So you say, therefore, if the government is able to do something about illegal prostitution by making it legal, it is something safer for everyone and is definitely something we propose. So in that sense, you're really stepping through everything you need, which is very easy for the audience to follow. Okay, so last big thing that I wanted to cover in my section is talking about a very common type of argument that is often used in debating, and I think going through it is quite helpful. So freedom of choice. So freedom of choice is something that, I'm sure we all have an idea about, but in debating, it's kind of describing how we as individuals are able to consciously make decisions and consent to things. And because it is inherent to who we are, we should be allowed to honor that choice. And often that is a very effective argument because it is something that we value. So for example, you could say, individuals have the freedom of choice to either buy or sell their votes, or individuals have the freedom of choice to be a surrogate if they wish. But to prove that someone has the freedom of choice, there's a general kind of framework that you want to follow, which is also known as the framework for consent. So this is when you're used to argue that someone has the ability to consent to something, and you need to prove that they are informed, uncoerced, and rational. So I think going through these three things is very helpful because you're trying to convince the audience that in this case, freedom of choice still exists and is still something that should be honored. Because often one thing that kind of curbs freedom of choice is government responsibility and government obligation. So for example, like I could say I have the freedom of choice to not wear a seatbelt, but because the government recognizes that the safety is so important, the government is able to override that freedom of choice to mandate this seatbelt wearing. So in a lot of the cases, if you're arguing for freedom of choice, going through this kind of three-step model is a very effective way to do so. So firstly, informed. Basically, you just need to prove that the individual is informed enough and educated enough to make a correct decision based on the information provided to them. And it's just making sure that they have all the facts available, and therefore from these decisions, they are then able to make that choice. Secondly, you want to prove that they are uncoerced. So it means they're not forced by anyone else and they are largely making the decision on their own accord. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult to prove. So you want to make sure that you frame this uncoerced factor as convincingly as possible, because we live in a society, right? So we're constantly being influenced by other people and things in the world, but you can convince the audience that you are acting independently enough to be kind of fully responsible of your decisions and isn't something that can be attributed to other people. And lastly, you want to prove that this person is rational, so that they're in a rational state of mind when you are making a decision. And often to be rational, you have to be not being under the influence of alcohol and drugs, if that's relevant to your case. And often you need to be quite detached and separated from the emotions of a particular decision to be able to be acting in a rational sense. So often freedom of choice arguments are quite powerful. And in that sense, it can be quite difficult to rebut freedom of choice because it seems that like, oh, well, obviously it's just inherent. But sometimes to effectively rebut a certain argument like this, you need to try and prove that this choice here doesn't fall under this particular right. So these are just some examples. So firstly, you want to prove that they're under duress. So the person doesn't have enough information about that choice or is actually incapable of making that choice. And often if someone is incapable, for example, if they're quite young, they're just not able to make that choice because they're not informed enough, they don't understand the severity of an issue, something like that. Secondly, you might talk about how their choice actually creates a burden on society. So if you can prove that someone's choice creates a burden so excessive on someone else, then the freedom of choice argument should be overruled. So, for example, smoking, even though someone is making the decision to smoke, like passive smoking or secondhand smoke, you could argue that it is creating a burden on someone else and therefore should be banned. Lastly, you can talk about how a choice could be personally too harmful so that the government has to step in. So in that case, you could use a seatbelt example where you want to drive without seatbelt, but it's so bad that the government recognizes that it will harm you and therefore the government has a right to overrule that. And you have to be careful though, because for this rebuttal to kind of hold up, the choice is sometimes almost always illegal. So for example, if as making something illegal is the government's way of kind of labeling that it's too harmful for society. So the reason why wearing a seatbelt is it's mandated is because we recognize without doing so it's illegal. The reason why illegal drugs is illegal because we feel the government feels that people are not able to consent enough and that it is too harmful. So sometimes you need to so this is when illegal drugs fail this kind of freedom of choice argument. So regardless of what kind of argument you're making under freedom of choice, there are often ways of overriding that. So speaking of rebuttal, we now move on to part 2 of how to rebut, which will be taken by Jake.
Yeah, hello. Rebuttal, can we go to the next slide? There we go. So rebuttal basically is counter-arguing. It's just the debating term for it. And it will usually happen. So you won't really counter-argue if you're the first speaker that much. It's more so later on in the debate. Even if you're first opposition, so you speak second, it's more about framing your case, even in that position, rather than responding to the first speaker. The way that rebuttal works is surprisingly difficult because it's very easy to fall into poor lines of logic and fallacies. And so when you're coming up with counter arguments, it's really good to consider this list of 3 things, because these are basically the only 3 ways to not be arguing in a fallacy. So logically, morally, and practically / evidentially. Logically is more about the principles themselves. It's about the line of argument. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Is what essentially is what they said actually true? But it's not necessarily to do with like if they made a mistake or they quoted a figure wrong, because that's evidence. It's more the actual argument itself. So the example here is, for example, the death penalty should be reinstated because prisoners suffer more via death is logically incorrect, because once you die, your suffering ends. The case for the death penalty is retribution for victims, not to make criminals suffer more. And that's a perfectly good way to counter an argument, because you don't just make the point, you also have the second sentence. It's important to counter the argument first and then use that to help your own case. So you're saying that they're wrong, which is important because it sort of devalues what they're saying, but then you're making a new point for your side, which is that the death penalty actually makes criminals suffer less, which is a point in your favor. And then morally is more interesting, because obviously we don't really agree on what is considered moral or not. So morally is quite a difficult way to counter an argument. But there's basically two ways that you can do it. It's either appealing to intuition and saying, well, the vast majority of people think this way, so it can be considered an ethic, or you can go for a particular sort of ethical paradigm, which normally will end up being utilitarianism. And utilitarianism, if you use it, you should say, British society is largely utilitarian, which is the principle of trying to attain the greatest pleasure or the greatest good for the greatest number of people. You properly spell out what paradigm you're arguing from, and then you apply it to the case. So in this example, the death penalty should apply to all crimes is morally incorrect, because intuitively humans just don't believe that someone should be killed for stealing a loaf of bread to feed their children. And using that sort of example to display the immorality of it is generally a good idea, because it really helps the audience see what you're saying, understand your point, and follow on through your logic. Conversely, you could say something like, the death penalty should apply to all crimes is morally incorrect because it defies utilitarianism. The amount of harm caused by killing someone, especially to that person's family, is greater than the amount of harm that society suffers because someone stole a loaf of bread to feed their children. So those are sort of the two ways to do it. The second one is technically more correct, but it takes more time and it's a bit more complex. So it's about choosing which one at the time to go for. The third way is separate, but it does tie into logically and morally as well, and that's the evidence. So it's a useful way to, again, prove that the opposition doesn't really know what they're talking about, and then you can piggyback off it to create a new point. So the example here, the death penalty should be instated because majority opinion in the UK agrees with it, is evidentially incorrect because less than 40% of the UK believe in a death penalty, and that's only for paedophiles. Even murder has less support. So you've already proven them wrong, so you have countered their point, but a great way to expand on that would be to say something like, in fact, the fact that most people in the UK oppose the death penalty, even in extreme cases, demonstrates that our culture deems it immoral. And then you're using their flawed evidence to then create a moral argument for your own side. And creating those novel points is very important, because it means that you're progressing the conversation rather than just sort of falling into a bit of a stalemate, which can be quite boring for the audience to watch. And so you may sort of lose them. And at the end of the day, the purpose of debating is to win over the audience. Next slide, please. Okay, so framing the case. You'll usually do your rebuttal sort of at the start of your speech later in the debate. So in the same way as what Tash was going over before about how to be substantive, that still applies to rebuttal, and it's good to speak in terms of syllogisms. So syllogism is just a term that means a form of argument that has like premise one, premise two, and then a conclusion that necessarily follows from the premises. So I used another example here than the death penalty, where you use a range of flaws in the opponent's argument, and then you use it to create a new point for your own case. So it's extremely important to directly repeat what point you're countering. So for example, you literally say, the opposition argues that all female quotas are necessary in politics because every party is comprised mostly of men and they neglect female issues. You then can move on with, oftentimes it will be an evidential counter-argument first. So you can just discount what they said and say, however, currently the Labour Party has 57% of MPs as women. So it makes it look like they haven't researched properly, which in fairness, in this case, they wouldn't have done. And then you try and look at the principle of what they just said. So when the opponent said, every party is comprised mostly of men and they neglect female issues, the implication of that and the assumption that they've made is that men neglect female issues, whereas women don't. So then you counter that more nuanced point and say, despite most Labour MPs being women, they still do not support many solutions to female issues. You then provide examples, extended maternity leave, more flexible working hours. And then you also expand the conversation and say, the Conservative Party has even had 2 female prime ministers and neither have tackled these issues. You've essentially destroyed every part of the opponent's point while getting the audience on your side and grounding things more, using lots of real world examples. And then it's good to just, as I say, land the finishing blow. Therefore, the opposition's case for having more women in politics is demonstrated not to pan out in practice. Women do not necessarily stand up for female issues, so the logic is flawed. And this last point at the bottom is the main thing. So listen intently to what your opponent says. Picking up on poor phrasing, even if you know what they meant to say, is where a lot of rebuttal comes from. The audience is often less educated on the debating motion than you, and the purpose is to cater to them rather than your opponent. A lot of debating is just speaking better than the opponent. It's not even necessarily about being right. It's basically a popularity contest. And so in that sense, it's the most important thing is to just speak well and try to discredit the opponent, even if they basically made the right point and they're basically along the right lines. But yeah, if they didn't display their point that well, you can try and discredit them. Next slide, please. Okay, so only in-person debates, which hopefully will be most of them soon, but you can't really do it on Zoom calls. So these are points of information. While the opposition is speaking, you can stand up to offer a point of information, and standing up is offering it. You don't need to do anything else. The opponent either accepts or rejects it. Don't speak unless accepted, and it's usually a hand movement like this to accept it or this to tell you to sit down, so that the opponent can keep speaking and finishing their sentence, and it's the most practical way to use your time. This is an opportunity to make a single succinct rebuttal. If you use too much time, you'll often be dismissed, which they can do anytime by doing that again. And it's literally a sentence at most, generally a short sentence, and it will usually be either evidence or moral. Fitting an entire logical counter-argument into one sentence is pretty tricky, and it's usually better to wait until it's your turn to speak before you do that. Or if you've already spoken, you can write it on a piece of paper and give it to someone on your team, in case they haven't noticed the logical flaw. So using the previous example, that's a good point of information would be, as soon as the opponent says, every party is comprised mostly of men, you stand up and say, well, the Labour Party is 57% of MPs as women, and you've just made them look a bit silly. Another way to do it is almost to pose a question, but a very loaded question. So if somebody says, for example, down here, at some point we have to accept that natural selection is legitimate and let old people die off. You can stand up and say, do you really believe that the UK as a culture would ever be able to accept this line of argument? It's against all of our values. It's a very loaded question, but it's almost constructive in that you're giving them a chance to respond, and generally they'll flounder if you load the question adequately. And then at the bottom, I said it's essentially gotcha journalism, which it really is. Gotcha journalism is just trying to catch, is when the interviewer tries to catch whoever they're giving the interview out and make them look silly, and try and prove them wrong. And it's just short little sound bites that you can do to try and make yourself look better than the opponent. And yeah, so this is the rebuttal reverse pyramid. It's basically a diagram of a lot of what I said. So the top thing, grammatical errors and personal attacks, are not rebuttal. Do not do those. They simply do not matter. And personal attacks will actually make you look much worse than whoever the opponent is. But it's important to have on here because, for example, in terms of at some point we have to accept that natural selection is legitimate and let old people die off. There's a difference between saying you're immoral if you think that, you're absolutely satanic if you think that, that's never acceptable, and saying I don't think that line of logic would ever be considered moral or ethical within the UK. The first one is a personal attack. The second one is essentially analysis, which is a lower tier. And almost a principle as well. The evidence and examples is, I think, the tier below, because just rebutting evidence or just providing counter evidence isn't a very good point in itself. What's necessary if you use evidence in your counter argument, which is a good idea, is to then expand on it and analyze your evidence in contrast with theirs, or use your evidence to express principles and assumptions. And that's the rest of it. Analysis is basically just counter-arguing in general. If you counter-argue, you will probably be analyzing by default. But the principles and assumptions at the bottom is very important because it's more so about the implications of what the opponent said rather than what the opponent said itself. And so you need to be listening very intently, and figuring out both what the opponent has said and what they've left out. So again, in the previous example, you have the implication or the assumption of men care about female issues and men don't care about female issues and women do. That's a principle and assumption that the opponent didn't say, but you can call out, and it's more impressive if you manage to. A final thing is, it's also necessary to justify why your point is more important than the opponent's point. So in a lot of good debating motions, both sides are kind of correct. Debating motions are intended to be fair. And so when you're countering their argument, perhaps they are genuinely wrong. But if what they said is, technically true, but it's something that would benefit, say, 30% of the population, whereas your side would benefit 70% of the population, then you need to spell that out, and you need to say, yes, maybe this would really help out, like millionaires. Let's say tax cuts would help out millionaires. That would be incredible for the millionaires. That's true. But taxes are used to benefit the vast majority of the UK. And because there are so many more people who benefit from better education and a well-funded NHS, tax cuts are not a good idea, because the millions of people are more important than the millionaires. That's a good way to phrase a counter-argument, which is, again, sort of appealing to intuition and morality. And I think now we hand it back to Tash. So.
Great, thanks, Jake. Okay. All right, so the last section will be just covering style. So I think often presentation is much clearer when it comes to in-person debating rather than Zoom. But there are still elements of it that can be quite important, especially the way how you carry yourself. online as well. Definitely not as relevant, unfortunately, but I think these are still very important skills in general when it comes to debating or just, presenting and communicating with other people. So I think the most important things boils down to three things: volume, speed, and engagement. So I think especially when you're in a large room with volume, the biggest concern is definitely that you are able to be heard. And like the baseline, absolute basic level is that the audience can hear what you're saying, because otherwise there really isn't much point as to carrying on. I think also it is very important to consider the effect volume can have. So sometimes by varying your volume, you are varying your tone as well. And by that, it means that people can if you speak a little bit softer on some maybe emotional issues, or kind of highlighting just how sad some things can actually be, you're also encouraging people to lean forwards a little bit more and listen ahead, to really focus in on what you're saying. And so, especially if you're talking about a very important part, raising your volume and varying that volume level also creates a point of interest for people, where sometimes you're raising the volume at a very critical moment and then drawing it back to kind of create that contrast and make your speech overall more interesting and clearer as to what other points you're actually emphasizing. So, secondly, I think speed is definitely something that can be overlooked. Again, with volume, you need a baseline. You can't talk super, super fast because no one will understand you. And in general, we think we speak slower than we actually are. And often when you're nervous, you tend to speak faster. So, I think it's very difficult, but something you can learn to do, where you physically try to train yourself to speak slower. It makes you sound more deliberate in your thinking. It makes you sound more measured and controlled, rather than speaking at an unreasonable pace where it's really difficult to follow, kind of like what I'm doing right now. So often it does take, practice your speech where you feel comfortable to the point where you can dial it back and you know what you're going to say next. And I think also similarly to volume, it is an important tool to kind of encourage your audience to keep listening, because by varying certain things, you are emphasizing also what is important and what you really want to touch upon. So often, before you talk about very impactful points, or when you get to the absolute crux of your speech, you might do a little pause. Because during that absence of sound, you slow down the pace and you really draw attention to what you are saying. And then often after that, you kind of want to follow up with a slightly faster pace to kind of create that contrast in a very similar way with volume. And overall, it does allow the audience, especially during slow parts or pauses, for them to be able to digest all that information and then keep up with what you are saying. So then lastly, I think engagement is something that kind of relates to volume and speed, but also other things you can do to engage your audience more. And by kind of thinking about what type of audience you have, for example, over Zoom or in person, there are different ways you can tailor it to make it much more interesting for the overall audience. So I think firstly is eye contact. So I'm trying to look into the camera as I speak right now, where I feel like I'm trying to connect to the people I'm talking to. It is definitely quite scary, especially in person, but that way you feel like you are directing your arguments to someone and that they are actually listening to what you are saying. I think one tool that I use definitely when I didn't feel comfortable with eye contact is to look at the exact kind of middle between the eyes, so like around here somewhere, just to look at that area instead of their eyes and kind of look at different people. And often you might just want to choose a random person in the audience unknowingly and just look at them for a little bit and then switch eye contact. Or you can also alternate between just kind of scanning in the audience, or looking up when you're thinking, or like gesturing and all of that. Like all of those extra kind of non-verbal communication is quite important in addressing your point. And often hand gestures, which I'm kind of doing now, but you can't really see because I'm sitting down, but it does help to kind of bring the focus to yourself, where you feel like if you're extending your arm kind of outwards like that, you're making a much more open gesture, and people can feel that it is much more welcoming, instead of if you're just standing there with your arms crossed, which kind of gives a very kind of cold and uncomfortable kind of like distance between yourself and the audience. So such non-verbal communication aspects are also quite important. And I think also when it comes to debating in real life, when you have, say, a desk in front of you or paper, one thing that is very important to make something more engaging is that you don't have an absolute script written down, because then you tend to want to read everything and you're not really looking up as much, or your voice sounds much more forced. So I think a natural way to avoid doing that is to just have dot points, or rehearse, or kind of just make it up on the spot, but have general key points that you want to follow, because that way you tend to be more organic and your voice actually does change. It sounds much more natural when you're talking, and it's natural to have ums and ahs or accidental repetitions of what you're saying. But then by slowing down sometimes, by looking at your notes, by not copying a script by line by line in your script, it can be much more natural and easier to engage with. And so I think lastly, that kind of relates to what I was saying about being too scripted, or being kind of on automatic mode, where you're just reading line by line and you aren't paying attention to how you're speaking, and you end up speaking in a monotone, kind of like this. That definitely is not engaging at all. So by trying to consciously remember that you are presenting kind of almost a performance, not like a dramatic performance, but you are wanting to make your arguments as strong as possible. And a really big way of doing that is through your style. So that is through your volume, it is through your speed, it is through your engagement. Because even if you have the best speech ever in debating, if you're presenting it in a way that diminishes that power, it is much harder for the audience or even the adjudicator to want to listen in and actually hear all the amazing things you're saying. So in that sense, style might seem like an easy thing or not as important thing compared to content, but I think definitely it can be something that is overlooked, but really should be something that people pay attention to. So that kind of brings us to the end of this overall presentation and session about how to be an effective debater. So here at Fifth Debate, we have quite a few events lined up, definitely less this term because of exams, but we do have upcoming 2 debates this term. This house believes that media outlets that spread misinformation should be banned, and also this house would have a quota for women in parliament. So those are our 2 main events happening this term. So if you are interested, please do message this page on Facebook or send an email, and all the contact information is on Facebook. And also any other way you can contact myself or any others on the committee, you're more than welcome to do so. And it'd be great if we had anyone there. So feel free to check us out on Facebook, follow our page, and also join our mailing list to ensure you're staying up to date. Jake, do you have anything else you wanted to say?
Not really, just thank you for coming, and thank you for watching this later if anyone watches the recording. And yeah, hope to see you at debates. They are a fun time. So
yeah, definitely. All right, thanks. Thank you everyone for coming, and hope you have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.